Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the line of combat contact, and we will start with the Sumy direction, where according to information we have, most likely the Ukrainians as a result of counter-offensive managed to secure the village of Kondratyevka completely. So as for the beginning of the 26th of July, as you can see, the pro-Ukraine resources colored the village of Kondratyevka completely under Ukraine control. Most likely after a month of very heavy clashes, the Russians were forced to fall back. As for now, we will mark these territories as a contested area until we get additional clarifications or additional proofs. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kupiansk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. And this time it seems that the Russians are trying to establish complete control over the city of Kupiansk itself. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their position significantly. We can take a look at how exactly the Russian offensive operation in this area was developing. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 24th of July of 2025, and according to different sources, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the north and the northwest of the city of Kupiansk. By the end of the 25th of July of 2025, according to several videos and geolocations that were provided by different sources, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly to the north of the city of Kupiansk. The Russians secured the village of Yabunovka, but as for now, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation haven't confirmed this information, and the Russians managed to improve their positions along the railways in the direction of the settlement of Tishinkovka. So that was another breakthrough in this area. But there is an important detail that I would like to point to attention. Several months ago, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation have already reported that the Russians secured the villages of Mirova and Sobolevka, but without proofs and without geolocations. So that was very interesting, and basically that was fantastic report that we got several months ago, because if this information was confirmed a month or two ago, this would mean that the city of Kupiansk were caught and cauldron by the Russians a long time ago. But just now we start receiving updates and geolocations and reports of different mappers that the situation is exactly like was described by the Ministry of Defense. By the morning of the 26th of July, we have additional changes. According to neutral mappers, the Russians improved their positions in the northern part of the city of Kupiansk. The Russians are advancing along R79 road and are trying to get as close as possible to the Kupiansk citadel in the northern part of the city. Furthermore, as you can see, the Russians are trying to tighten the news around positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in the area of the village of Tishinkovka. But the most important and the most interesting update was provided by pro-Ukrainian resources. As you can see, they also adjusted their map in this area. According to them, indeed, the village of Radkovka was secured by the Russians. Furthermore, according to pro-Ukrainian resources, the Russians almost secured the village of Mirova. But the most important update is a gray zone expanded much further in the southwestern direction. According to Deep State, the Russians were the presence of the armed forces of the Russian Federation was recorded already inside of this pocket. It seems that currently the Russians are trying to advance much further and much deeper in the southwestern direction towards the settlement of Nechvolodovka and of course in the direction of the settlement of Sobolevka. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. We don't have a lot of updates and geolocations from this area, and most of the updates in this area were made based on reports both of the Ministry of Defense and neutral and Ukraine mappers. The video that we discussed along the railways in the vicinity of Tishinkovka is possibly the only video from this area published that was published for the period of time more than 6 or 7 months. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive along N26 road to the west of the settlement of Stepovo Novoselka. Additional strongholds and positions of the armored forces of Ukraine were were taken by the Russians, and as you can see, the Russians are getting closer and closer to the settlement of northern Pischana and to the southwestern eastern flanks of the settlement of Petropavlovka. So we see that this is not something like the Pokrovsk offensive operation, but in a month or in 2 months, most likely the Russians will begin their major battle for the city, because they're getting closer and closer to cut Ukrainian contingent on the territory of the city of Kupiansk from supply and support. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Sivas direction. And the most important updates this time are coming from the Cibriana Forest. Telling the truth, I probably for the previous several months I had some doubts whether the Russians are able to take this territory under complete control. The Ukrainians managed to restore control over the Cibriana Forest in 2022 during their Kharkiv counteroffensive operation, and since that moment the Russians made thousands maybe attempts to restore control both over the city of Cibrianka, Grigorovka and the Cibriana Forest, but all those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians. The Russians during the previous several years suffered huge losses during the battle for this territory, and this morning the pro-Russian resources published this video, and here we can see how Russian soldiers in different parts of the Cibriana Forest were raising their flags and the signs of the units that were responsible for their offensive operation. So this building, for example, was geolocated. This flag was, let's say, raised by the Russians exactly above this area. So based on this video, most of the mappers adjusted their maps, but telling the truth, currently nobody knows for sure how exactly the map should be adjusted, because it's very difficult to understand how exactly the Russians get there. Maybe the Russians entered these, let's say, building and these facilities from the north. Maybe the Russians managed to get there from the east, or maybe the Russians managed to take under complete control these territories by moving along lakes and rivers that are located on the territory of the Cibriana Forest. So anyway, as for now, we adjusted the map as we adjusted. Of course, we are waiting for additional geolocations and additional updates from this area. And so let's wait and see what is going to be next. But obviously, this is a very important step made by the Russian forces in the entire progress and in the Russian offensive operation towards the cities of Siversk and Liman. Without control over the Cibriana Forest, Russians will have less chances to improve their positions further in the western direction. Now let's talk about the city of Konstantinovka. The most important updates are coming from the area to the south of the Kliban-Byksky pocket. As you can see, the map has been adjusted once again. So this is the situation. For example, let's compare the maps first of all. So this is the situation by the end of the 25th of July of 2025. I would like to remind you that several days ago we got reports that the Russians secured the village, and there were several videos with Russian flags all over the entire territory of Yabunovka. But the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation yet hasn't confirmed Russian control over the territory. And in the evening of the 25th of July and by the morning of the 26th of July, we got another video published by the Russian sources. And here we can see how Russians were fighting for the eastern flank, for the eastern part of the settlement. In this video, we can see several FPV drone attacks. And of course, in the final part of this video, we can see how Russians were moving in this area, taking Ukrainians under control, and how Russians were raising their flags in different parts of the village. So the Russians raised their flags in the most northeastern part here, and the Russians raised the flag in the most southern part of the settlement of Yabunovka. But as you can see, based on this video, we haven't adjusted anything because the village was colored several days ago. At the same time, several mappers, neutral mappers, and pro-Russian resources reported that the village of Alexandra Kalinova was also taken by the Russians by the morning of the 26th of July of 2025. And based on these reports, we added additional contested area or the gray zone. This is the situation by the end of the 25th of July, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 26th of July. Most likely these days, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm control both over the village of Yabunovka and Alexandra Kalinova, and then the territory will get additional colors. Now let's talk about the most important direction, the city of Pokrovsk, and first let's talk about the northeastern part. The Russians continue their offensive operation. And when talking about different mappers, today we got reports published by neutral mappers and pro-Ukrainian resources that they confirmed Russian control over the territory. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive operation further in the northwestern direction, and as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to enter and to improve their positions in the village of Zatishek, and as we can see, the Russians are getting closer and closer to the settlement of Zapovidne. So it's very difficult to read and to understand the Russian tactics in this area. From the first sight, it seems that the Russians are trying to improve their positions in the direction of the city of Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk agglomeration, but another day we got report that the Russians, instead of moving in the direction of the city, are moving in completely opposite direction. So as for now, there are still maneuvers, very heavy clashes. The Russians are trying to improve their positions, to cut Ukrainian logistic and basically and most likely to reduce possible losses which could happen during the battle for the city itself. At the same time, the Russians intensifies their offensive operations in the southeastern flank or in the southwestern flank of the city of Pokrovsk. During the previous 24 hours, according to different mappers, the Russians improved their positions significantly. Furthermore, we believe and we expect that during the upcoming days, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm Russian control over the village of Novoukrainka, Chinchina. The sources are saying that currently the Russians are fighting for the western flank and the western part of the settlement of Novopavlovka. So the Russians are there and the Ukrainians are there. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to take under complete control the most southern part of the city of Pokrovsk. We're talking about this residential area, and according to information we have, currently the clashes are taking place also for this area. So it seems that the Russians managed to take in pincers Ukrainian positions in the area of the southern Pokrovsk stronghold. We're talking about this part. So we are entering the most important and decisive phase of the battle for the city of Pokrovsk. If Ukrainians lose the southern Pokrovsk, most likely they will lose the entire agglomeration, and this is going to happen very fast. As for the South Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk directions, the Russians continue their offensive operation further in the western direction, trying to improve their positions already on the territory of the Dnipro region. The Russians' resources reported they answered the village of Malyevka. There are very heavy clashes right now, and that the Russians continue offensive operation in the fields towards the border with Dnipro region, trying to outflank the settlement of Alexandergrad and Andreevka-Klivtsova. So there are very heavy clashes, and several resources affiliated with the group of Forces East, which is responsible for this direction, reported that today we're going to receive lots of very interesting and very important updates about Russian offensive operation in this direction. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.